Credit unions have been impacting the lives of millions of New Yorkers for nearly 100 years. But to fully understand the history of the New York credit union movement, we must begin in 19th century Europe.
The cooperative movement, the idea of an enterprise being owned and operated by its members, who then share in its profits or benefits, began to take hold in Europe in the early 1800s.
It was in England in 1844 that the New York credit unions we know today began to take shape.
The Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers documented the principles of their consumer cooperative. Ideals that included open, voluntary membership, democratic member control, education and training, and concern for the community. Today, these principles are the cornerstone of cooperative economics. Financial cooperatives began in Germany. In 1854, Frederick Wilhelm Raiffeisen started the first rural credit union. Because rural areas were poor and cash was scarce, volunteering, sharing, and solidarity were necessary. People helping people. Credit unions came to North America in 1901 in Quebec, Canada. In 1908, organizer Alphonse Desjardins was summoned by a French-Canadian community in Manchester, New Hampshire, to do likewise for them.
Now, if you give workers an easy access to a reservoir of funds with easy interest and payment terms, it changes everything. The cooperative association is not one of capital funds, but of people. Each member, regardless of his contribution in capital, is on a perfectly equal footing with all of his fellow members. That is to say, each has but a single vote.
La Caisse Populaire Saint-Marie, St. Mary's Bank, became America's first credit union that day, November 24th, 1908. Funded by $10 million from the estate of her railroad magnate and financier husband Russell Sage, Mrs. Margaret Olivia Sage started the Sage Foundation in New York City in 1907. Its mission was to tackle the social problems not being addressed, and one of their first targets was usury, the making of unethical monetary loans, or loan sharking. The foundation's Albert Ham authored a report on the chattel loan business, and it was Ham who traveled to Canada in 1912 to seek Desjardins' help in getting a credit union law in New York. By 1913, a bill was drafted, and on May 17th, the Eisner-Pollock Bill, as it was known, became law. New York followed Massachusetts as the second state in the nation with a credit union law. Credit unions began then to open. By 1917, the growing number in New York warranted a central organization, so the New York State Association of Credit Unions was formed. But the Great War had its effect. Many people, particularly the foreign-born, were holding on to their money, afraid to deposit it in a credit union or a bank. Credit unions languished. The Roaring '20s, though, did see significant growth for the movement. On the national level, Massachusetts businessman Edward Filene and attorney Roy Bergengren started the Credit Union National Extension Bureau to fight for credit union laws, to open more credit unions, and ultimately create a credit union national organization. In New York, Bergengren recruited Dora Maxwell, an original state association board member, to get credit unions chartered by the New York Banking Department.
As she once explained, her job would not be an easy one.
I used to go down to the banking department and literally have to screw up my courage to open the door and go in. The banking commissioner sat in a huge room with his back to the window so that you were facing the window and the light in your eyes was blinding you. These huge windows were always a terrible disadvantage. You had to walk across this enormous room toward the sky, and in each corner of the room was a thug. I didn't know they were thugs at first, but later on I discovered not only were they thugs, they were armed. They sat there with pistols and watched. They just sat there.
As Maxwell fought for the charter she would ultimately get, the movement began to rebound. Within a year, there were more than 100 credit unions in New York City, and Bergengren had Maxwell take the movement upstate. The prosperity of the Roaring '20s helped make borrowing socially acceptable. But the banks showed little interest in the small saver or borrower, but credit unions did. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged the nation and the world into the Great Depression. Savings were lost, banks were closed, financial lives were ruined. but credit unions withstood the collapse. None were forced to close.
The words of Sidney Stahl, one of New York's early credit union leaders, explain why.
The Depression strengthened the credit unions in the state of New York. The members realized that they needed their credit union, and they developed a greater interest in and an attachment for their financial self-help organization. One of the reasons why most credit unions were able to come through the Depression not only unscathed, but in a large number of cases actually stronger than they had been before, is that their reserve requirements were adequate to meet the contingencies of the 1930s.
All the while, New Yorkers were heavily lobbying Congress to pass the Federal Credit Union Act, which it did in 1934.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who as a state senator worked on the New York bill 20 years earlier, signed the new legislation, which allowed for credit union growth in states that did not have their own law.
1934 also saw the beginning of the Credit Union National Association. Sidney Stahl and Dora Maxwell led the New York delegation to the historic Colorado gathering that cemented credit unions as a part of the national landscape. Back in New York, another growth spurt was underway. In an 18-month span, the state more than doubled its number of credit unions to nearly 400. One of the new members of the New York State Employees Credit Union was Governor Herbert Lehman, who became the first credit union governor in the United States. The 40s saw the U.S. in another world war, and New York credit unions rallied to support the troops by selling war bonds, an effort that brought national recognition. And when so much of New York's credit union leadership went off to fight, women stepped up to take a more active role in leadership and management. Post-war, growth returned, and by the end of the decade, there were nearly 800 credit unions statewide, with 365,000 members and $68 million in assets. The growth of the movement was celebrated in October 1948 with the first Credit Union Day. The now International Credit Union Day continues to recognize the movement's history, growth, achievements, and the hardworking people who were and are the foundation of its successes. New York credit unions reinvested their successes in opening the Sidney Stahl Foundation in 1959. Now the Credit Union Foundation, it continues to embody the movement's heritage of community and charity. By the mid-70s, the Credit Union Association moved its operations to Albany to better represent members' interests in the halls of state government. The federal government must also hear the strong voice of the credit union movement, for success does not come without cost. Across the years, credit unions have been forced to defend their principles in courts and the Congress. In 1991, 1,000 New Yorkers were part of the throng in Washington that fought back against a discrediting information campaign.
In 1998, members again descended upon Congress and preserved access to not-for-profit and member-owned credit unions.
And during the Great Recession in the early 21st century, credit union membership soared, people drawn to credit unions' security and stability.
Don't tax my credit union!
And in 2013, it was protecting the federal tax exemption that allows credit unions to reinvest in their members. New Yorkers were at the front of the campaign, preserving members' access to a chance at financial growth, quality of life, and equal opportunity.
A comforting constant from the Equitable Pioneers to Desjardins to tomorrow's generation of the cooperative credit union movement.